Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up, or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. The story I'm about to tell you spans from the ashes of World War I to the rise of the Nazi Party. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how these seemingly glamorous figures helped destroy an entire civilization. This isn't just history, it's a warning about what happens when society completely loses its way. So let's dive into the twisted world of Weimar Berlin, where heroin was currency, morality was a luxury nobody could afford, and women with pharmaceutical inheritances became the queens of a very dark kingdom. November 1918. Germany has just lost the most devastating war in human history. 4 years of industrial slaughter have left the country broken, humiliated, and desperate. But in the ruins of the old empire, something new and terrifying is about to emerge. The Weimar Republic, named after the city where its constitution was signed, would become synonymous with excess, experimentation, and moral collapse. But here's what most people don't know about Weimar Berlin. The chaos wasn't random. The decadence wasn't accidental. Much of it was orchestrated by a small group of incredibly wealthy women who saw opportunity where others saw only destruction. These women didn't inherit just money. They inherited chemical empires built on morphine and cocaine, legitimate pharmaceutical businesses that had supplied painkillers to the German army during the war. When the war ended and regulations crumbled along with everything else, these heiresses found themselves sitting on gold mines of addictive substances and unlimited access to the means of production. What they did next would make them some of the most powerful and dangerous figures in one of history's most chaotic decades. Let me introduce you to Margaret von Siemens, though that wasn't the name she was born with. Born Greta Müller in a working-class neighborhood of Hamburg, she clawed her way up through German society with a combination of ruthless ambition and an intuitive understanding of human weakness. By 1919, at just 23 years old, she had married into the pharmaceutical fortune of the von Siemens family, not the famous electrical company, but their lesser-known cousins who had made their money in medical supplies. When her elderly husband died under mysterious circumstances just 6 months after their wedding, Margaret found herself in control of 3 morphine processing facilities and a distribution network that stretched across Central Europe. Most widows would have sold the business and lived comfortably on the proceeds. Margareta had bigger plans. She looked at post-war Germany and saw exactly what it was: a nation of traumatized, desperate people looking for any escape from their reality. Soldiers returning from the front were already addicted to morphine from their medical treatment. Civilians were starving and willing to try anything that might numb their pain. The government was too weak and chaotic to enforce drug laws effectively. It was the perfect storm someone willing to exploit human misery for profit. But Margaret wasn't content to simply sell morphine to existing addicts. She wanted to create new markets, new forms of addiction, new ways to trap people in cycles of dependence. That's when she discovered heroin. Now, heroin wasn't new in 1919. It had been synthesized from morphine in 1874 and was initially marketed by pharmaceutical companies as a non-addictive alternative to morphine for treating coughs and pain. By the time Margaret got her hands on it, medical professionals were beginning to understand just how wrong they had been about its addictive properties. But Margaret saw this as a feature, not a bug. She began hosting what she called pharmaceutical salons in her mansion in Berlin's fashionable Charlottenburg district. These weren't your typical upper-class dinner parties. Guests would arrive to find silver trays laden with white powder alongside the usual assortment of fine foods and wines. Margaret would personally demonstrate the effects of her products, teaching wealthy socialites how to inject heroin between their toes to avoid visible track marks, how to mix cocaine with champagne for the perfect party cocktail, how to time their doses to maintain functionality during the day while achieving euphoria at night. The genius of Margaret's approach was that she made drug use fashionable among Berlin's elite before expanding into the general population. When wealthy socialites were seen using her products at the opera, at art galleries political, at fundraisers, it created a trickle-down effect that normalized drug use throughout German society. But the pharmaceutical salons served another purpose beyond just creating customers. They were networking events where Marguerite recruited other wealthy women into her growing criminal enterprise. She had an eye for spotting women who shared her particular combination of ambition, ruthlessness, and complete lack of moral restraint. One of her earliest and most successful recruits was Helena Kruger, the daughter of a steel magnate who had lost everything in Germany's post-war economic collapse. Helena had been raised in luxury and couldn't bear the thought of living anything as less than nobility. When Margaret offered her a partnership in the heroin trade, Helena didn't hesitate. Helena brought something crucial to the organization that Margaret lacked: connections to Germany's criminal underworld. Her family's financial ruin had forced her to associate with loan sharks, black market dealers, and other unsavory characters. She knew how to launder money, how to bribe officials, how to eliminate competition through violence when necessary. Together, Margaret and Helena created what became known as the White Ladies, a criminal organization that controlled heroin distribution throughout Berlin and beyond. The name came from both the color of their product and their high society backgrounds, but there was nothing pure or innocent about what they were doing. The White Ladies operated like a sophisticated business enterprise. They had chemists who refined their products to maximize addictive potential. They had doctors on their payroll who would prescribe their drugs to unsuspecting patients. They had networks of dealers who worked everywhere from exclusive nightclubs to working-class neighborhoods. They even had their own private security force, made up of former soldiers who were loyal only to whoever paid them the most. But perhaps most importantly, they had a recruitment system that specifically targeted vulnerable women and turned them into both customers and dealers. The White Ladies understood that women made ideal drug dealers because they were less likely to be suspected by police and more likely to be trusted by potential customers. They would identify young women in desperate situations, recently widowed, unemployed, kicked out of their families, and offer them what seemed like salvation: a place to stay, expensive clothes, access to high society events, and all the drugs they could want. In exchange, these women would become part of the White Ladies distribution network, selling to their friends, their lovers, their families. It was a system that fed on itself, creating ever-expanding circles of addiction and dependency that generated enormous profits for Margaret and Helena, while destroying countless lives in the process. By 1922, the White Ladies controlled an estimated 60% of the heroin trade in Berlin and had expanded into other major German cities. They were generating profits equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in today's money, and they were just getting started. The chaos of hyperinflation that destroyed the German economy in 1923 only made them more powerful. When paper money became worthless overnight, drugs became a form of currency that retained its value. People who had lost their life savings were willing to trade family heirlooms, sexual favors, even their own children for just a few doses of heroin. The White Ladies adapted quickly to these changing conditions. They began operating what were essentially drug banks, where people could deposit valuables in exchange for regular doses of heroin. They started their own black market currency system, based on drug quantities rather than worthless German marks. They even began trading directly with foreign criminal organizations, exchanging German-produced heroin for American dollars and British pounds. But as their power grew, so did their ambitions. Margaret and Helena were no longer content to simply sell drugs to whoever wanted them. They began to see themselves as social engineers, using addiction as a tool to reshape German society according to their own twisted vision. They started targeting specific groups that they saw as obstacles to their plans. Politicians who opposed drug liberalization would find their children mysteriously developing expensive drug habits. Journalists who wrote critical articles about Berlin's drug problem would discover that their sources had become unreliable addicts. Police officers who got too close to their operations would find themselves facing planted evidence or false accusations. The white ladies were becoming more than just drug dealers. They were becoming a shadow government that operated through corruption, blackmail, and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in their way. And this was only the beginning of their story. What they would do next would make their early crimes seem almost innocent by comparison, because the heroin heiresses of Weimar Berlin were about to discover that there were forms of human trafficking far more profitable than simple drug dealing. But that's a story for the next part of this series, where we'll explore how these women turned their pharmaceutical empires into something far more sinister, and how their actions helped create the conditions that would eventually lead to the rise of fascism in Germany. The year 1923 brought more than just economic collapse to Germany. It brought Helene Kruger face to face with an opportunity that would transform the white ladies from successful drug dealers into something far more monstrous. The opportunity came in the form of a 17-year-old girl named Anna Richter, who would become the prototype for what the heroin heiresses would later call their living inventory. Anna had arrived in Berlin from the countryside, fleeing a family farm that had been destroyed by hyperinflation. Like thousands of other young women, she came to the capital with dreams of finding work, maybe even making it as a dancer or actress in one of the city's famous ballets. Instead, she found herself sleeping in doorways and scavenging for food scraps. Helena spotted Anna outside the Romanisches Café, one of Berlin's intellectual gathering places, where the girl was begging for coins from the artists and writers who still had enough money to afford coffee. But Helena wasn't moved by compassion. She saw something else entirely in Anna's desperate situation, a business opportunity that would prove far more lucrative than anything the white ladies had attempted before. Helena approached Anna with an offer that seemed too good to be true. A warm bed in a beautiful apartment, fashionable clothes, regular meals, and entry into Berlin's glamorous nightlife scene. All Anna had to do was attend parties and be charming to wealthy men. It sounded like every young woman's dream, and Anna accepted without hesitation. What Anna didn't understand was that she had just become part of an elaborate system that the white ladies had been developing for months. It started innocently enough. Anna was given a room in one of Helena's properties, a luxurious apartment building in the Schöneberg district that housed dozens of other young women in similar situations. She received beautiful dresses, jewelry, and makeup. She was taught proper etiquette and how to navigate high society conversations. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, other elements were introduced into Anna's new life. The parties she attended always featured Margaret's pharmaceutical products, presented as sophisticated recreational drugs that fashionable people used to enhance their experiences. Anna was encouraged to try small amounts, just enough to feel relaxed and confident at social events. The wealthy men Anna was introduced to weren't just random party guests. They were carefully selected clients who had specific tastes and were willing to pay premium prices for access to young women who met their particular preferences. Anna was told she was simply providing companionship, engaging conversation, and perhaps some light flirtation. The reality was far more sinister. Within 6 months, Anna had progressed from occasional heroin use to daily dependency. The white ladies had deliberately cultivated her addiction, gradually increasing the purity and frequency of her doses until she couldn't function without them. Once she reached this point, the true nature of her situation became clear. Anna wasn't just a party guest anymore. She was merchandise. The wealthy men who had been courting her weren't potential romantic partners. They were buyers in a human trafficking operation that specialized in addicted young women who could be controlled through their dependency on drugs. The genius of the White Ladies system was its apparent respectability. Unlike traditional prostitution rings that operated in seedy neighborhoods and back alleys, their operation functioned within Berlin's most fashionable social circles. Their victims lived in luxury apartments, wore expensive clothes, and attended high-class events. From the outside, they appeared to be living enviable lives as kept women or mistresses to wealthy men. But the reality was that these young women had become slaves in everything but name. They were completely dependent on their handlers for drugs, housing, food, and protection. They were bought and sold between clients like property, with their value determined by their physical attributes, their level of addiction, and their willingness to comply with increasingly degrading demands. Margareta and Helena had discovered that addicted women were far more valuable than simple drug customers. A regular heroin user might spend the equivalent of a few $100s per month on drugs, but an addicted woman who could be trafficked to wealthy clients might generate thousands of dollars per month in revenue, while simultaneously consuming the drugs that kept her dependent. The two women began scaling this operation with the same methodical approach they had used to build their drug empired recruitment. They established networks throughout Germany and neighboring countries, targeting young women who were displaced by economic chaos, family breakdown, or personal tragedy. They developed sophisticated methods for identifying which women were most vulnerable to manipulation and addiction. They also created a complex hierarchy within their trafficking operation. At the top were the heroin heiresses themselves, who rarely had direct contact with the victims, but made all the major strategic decisions. Below them were trusted lieutenants like Anna Richter, who had survived long enough in the system to earn positions as recruiters and handlers. These women used their own experiences to identify and manipulate new victims, knowing exactly what promises would be most appealing and what fears would be most effective for maintaining control. The middle tier consisted of apartment managers, party coordinators, and security personnel who handled the day-to-day operations of housing, transporting, and protecting the organization's human inventory. At the bottom were the victims themselves, who were kept isolated from each other and completely dependent on the system that was exploiting them. But the White Ladies weren't content to simply exploit individual women. They began experimenting with what they called cultural engineering, using their trafficking networks to influence broader social trends and political developments in Weimar Germany. They discovered that by strategically placing their victims in the social circles of politicians, journalists, and other influential figures, they could gather intelligence, spread propaganda, and manipulate public opinion on issues that affected their business interests. A drug-dependent woman who was sleeping with a newspaper editor could influence how stories about narcotics were covered in the press. Another, who was involved with a government minister, could provide advance warning about planned law enforcement raids or regulatory changes. This gave the White Ladies unprecedented power to shape the political and cultural landscape of Weimar Berlin. They weren't just profiting from the chaos of post-war Germany. They were actively contributing to that chaos by undermining social institutions and corrupting public officials. Their influence extended into Berlin's famous artistic and intellectual communities as well. Many of the writers, painters, and musicians who defined the cultural character of the Weimar period were unknowingly surrounded by women who were reporting their activities back to criminal organizations. The free-flowing creativity and experimentation that made Berlin a cultural capital was being systematically poisoned by human trafficking networks that saw art and intellectualism as just another market to be exploited. By the White Ladies' control, 1924 to D, what investigators would later estimate to be nearly 3,000 young neighboring Germany and women across countries. These weren't just German citizens. They were refugees from Russia, Poland, and other Eastern European countries that had been devastated by war and revolution. The organization had become an international human trafficking network that specialized in exploiting the chaos and displacement that followed major historical catastrophes. The profits from this operation dwarfed anything the white ladies had earned from simple drug dealing. They were generating revenue streams that allowed them to purchase entire apartment buildings, bribe high-level government officials, and fund political movements that supported their interests. They had transcended ordinary criminality to become a major economic and political force in German society. But their success was also creating new problems. As their operation grew larger and more complex, it became harder to maintain the secrecy and deniability that had protected them in their early years. Rival criminal organizations began attempting to muscle in on their territory. Law enforcement agencies that had been largely ineffective against drug dealing began developing new strategies for combating human trafficking. Most dangerously, the white ladies were attracting attention from political extremist groups that were looking for scapegoats to blame for Germany's social and economic problems. The same chaos and moral breakdown that had allowed the heroin heiresses to build their criminal empires was also creating conditions for the rise of radical political movements that would eventually threaten everyone who had profited from Weimar Germany's instability. Margaret von Siemens began receiving threatening letters from nationalist groups who saw her organization as a symbol of everything that was wrong with modern German society. Helene Kruger discovered that some of her former clients were now funding political parties that promised to restore moral traditional values through violent means. The heroin heiresses had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in exploiting the weakness and chaos of post-war Germany. But they were about to discover that the forces to unleash were bigger, they had help, and they could be more dangerous than anything control. And Anna Richter, the 17-year-old girl who had become the trafficking operation, was about to play prototype for their human role in events that would shake the very foundations of their criminal empire. Anna Richter had survived 3 years in the White Ladies organization by learning to read the subtle signs that preceded major upheavals. The way Margaret's voice changed pitch when she was planning something particularly ruthless. The pattern of Helena's late-night meetings with men who spoke in whispers and left through back entrances. The increasing frequency with which girls simply disappeared from the apartments without explanation. By early 1926, all these warning signs were flashing simultaneously, and Anna knew something catastrophic was approaching. What she couldn't have predicted was that the catastrophe would come from an unexpected direction, one that would force the heroin heiresses to confront enemies far more dangerous than rival criminals or corrupt police officials. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the pioneering sexologist who ran the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. Hirschfeld had been documenting the city's sexual underground for years, but his research was beginning to uncover patterns that led directly to the White Ladies' trafficking operations. Hirschfeld wasn't motivated by moral outrage or law enforcement concerns. He was a scientist who believed that understanding human sexuality required honest examination of all its manifestations, including the darkest ones. His institute had become a refuge for people whose sexual identities put them at odds with conventional society. And many of these individuals had encountered the White Ladies' operations firsthand. Through careful interviews with former victims and detailed analysis of Berlin's underground networks, Hirschfeld began mapping the structure of what slavery he called pharmaceutical, a system that used chemical dependency to control and exploit vulnerable individuals. His research revealed that the White Ladies weren't just running a trafficking operation, they were conducting what amounted to psychological experiments in human control. Margaret learned about Hirschfeld's research through one of her informants in Berlin's intellectual community. Her initial reaction was dismissive. What could an academic researcher do to threaten an organization that had survived police raids, gang wars, and economic collapse? But Helena recognized the danger immediately. Hirschfeld's scientific credibility gave him access to government officials, international organizations, and media outlets that had previously ignored the stories of individual victims. More importantly, Hirschfeld's research was attracting attention from abroad. International women's rights organizations were beginning to take notice of his findings about trafficking in Germany, foreign journalists were starting to investigate connections between German criminal organizations and similar networks in other countries. The White Ladies operation, which had thrived in the chaos and isolation of post-war Germany, was suddenly facing scrutiny from a much wider world. Helena's solution was characteristically ruthless. She decided to neutralize Hirschfeld by using the same methods that had worked so effectively against politicians and journalists. Several young women from their trafficking network were instructed to infiltrate the Institute for Sexual Research, posing as research subjects while actually gathering intelligence about Hirschfeld's work and the people who supported it. But Hirschfeld was far more sophisticated than the White Ladies' previous targets. He had spent years studying manipulation and exploitation, and he quickly recognized the patterns in his new research subjects' behavior. Instead of being deceived by their infiltration attempts, he used them as opportunities to gather even more detailed information about the trafficking network's operations. The game of cat and mouse between Hirschfeld and the White Ladies escalated throughout 1926. Each side thought they were manipulating the other, while both were actually being observed by a third party that neither had anticipated. The rising Nazi Party had identified both Hirschfeld's Institute and the White Ladies organization as symbols of the moral decay they claimed was destroying German society. Nazi propagandists saw perfect material in the story of wealthy women using pharmaceutical inheritances to traffic vulnerable girls into sexual slavery. It combined anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish corruption with misogynistic narratives about women overstepping their proper social roles. The fact that many of the trafficking victims were refugees from Eastern Europe allowed Nazi speakers to connect their anti-trafficking rhetoric to their broader campaign against foreign influence in German society. But the Nazis also saw opportunity in the chaos. Several high-ranking party members had been clients of the White Ladies' trafficking operation, and they understood firsthand how effectively the organization could be used to compromise and control political opponents. Rather than simply destroying the network, some Nazi strategists began exploring ways to co-opt it for their own purposes. Anna Richter found herself caught in the middle of this three-way struggle. As one of the White Ladies' most successful recruiters, she had detailed knowledge of the organization's operations that would be valuable to any of the competing factions. Hirschfeld's researchers had identified her as a potential source who might be willing to testify about her experiences. Nazi agents had approached her with offers of protection in exchange for information about the organization's wealthy Jewish clients. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and Anna began making plans for something she had never seriously considered before: escape. But leaving the White Ladies wasn't like quitting a job or ending a relationship. Women who tried to leave the organization typically faced one of three fates. They were murdered to prevent them from talking. They were sold to even more brutal trafficking networks in other countries. Or they were deliberately overdosed, and their deaths were staged to look like suicides. Anna's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating the organization's internal politics, told her that she needed to find a protector powerful enough to shield her from retaliation. Her first thought was to approach Hirschfeld's Institute, but she knew that academic researchers had limited ability to provide physical protection. The police were thoroughly corrupted by White Ladies' money and couldn't be trusted. That left the Nazis, who were rapidly becoming the most powerful political force in Berlin streets, even if they didn't yet control the government. Anna began carefully reaching out to Nazi contacts, offering information about the trafficking network in exchange for protection and a new identity. What Anna didn't realize was that her decision to collaborate with the Nazis would make her complicit in something far worse than anything she had experienced as a trafficking victim. The information she provided would be used not just to destroy the White Ladies organization, but to target hundreds of other women who had been involved with the network as victims, witnesses, or minor participants. The Nazis weren't interested in justice for trafficking victims. They were interested in creating a narrative that would justify their broader campaign against what they called degenerate elements in German society. Anna's testimony would be twisted to support claims that Jewish criminals and foreign influences were systematically corrupting German women, and that only radical political action could protect the nation from further moral decay. Meanwhile, Margarete von Siemens was facing her own impossible choices. The pharmaceutical empire that had made her trafficking operation possible was attracting unwanted attention from government regulators, who were finally beginning to understand the connection between legal drug manufacturing and illegal trafficking networks. International pressure was mounting for Germany to crack down on narcotics production, and several countries were threatening to impose trade sanctions if more aggressive action wasn't taken. Margaret's wealth and social connections had always protected her from serious legal consequences. But the political climate was changing in ways that made those protections increasingly unreliable. The same chaos and instability that had allowed her to build her criminal empire were now threatening to destroy it. Her response was to accelerate the most ambitious and dangerous project the White Ladies had ever attempted. If their German operations were going to be shut down anyway, she reasoned, they might as well extract maximum value from their existing assets while expanding into new markets that would be harder for authorities to monitor and control. The project was called the Eastern Route, and it involved moving their most valuable trafficking victims out of Germany entirely, establishing new operations in countries where government oversight was weaker and local officials were more easily corrupted. The plan required enormous logistical coordination, involving forged documents, bribed border guards, and partnerships with criminal organizations across Eastern Europe. But most ambitiously, the Eastern Route was a network that designed to create a permanent could survive the destruction of the White Ladies' German operations. Even if Margaret and Helena were arrested or killed, the trafficking system they had created would continue operating under new management in new locations. The first phase of the Eastern Route began in late 1926, with carefully selected groups of women being moved from Berlin to cities like Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest. These weren't random relocations. They were strategic deployments designed to establish the White Ladies' presence in new markets, while maintaining the dependency systems that kept their victims silent. Anna Richter was chosen compul to oversee one of these relocations, a decision that would put her at the center of events that would ultimately determine not just her own fate, but the fate of thousands of other women caught in the web of pharmaceutical slavery that the Heroin Heiresses had created. As 1927 began, the various forces that had been building around the White Ladies organization were about to collide in ways that would reshape not just Berlin's criminal underground, but the entire political landscape of Germany. The Heroin Heiresses had spent nearly a decade building their empire on the chaos and moral breakdown of post-war society. Now they were about to discover that the forces they had helped unleash were bigger, more violent, and more uncontrollable than anything they had ever imagined. The story of Anna Richter and the Eastern Route would become the final chapter in the rise of the White Ladies, and the first chapter in something far more terrible that was about to consume all of Europe. The winter of 1927 brought unexpected snow to Prague, and with it came Anna Richter and 12 other women who had been carefully selected for the Eastern Route's first major deployment. Anna had been told she was being promoted, given responsibility for establishing the White Ladies' operations in Czechoslovakia. What she discovered upon arrival was that she had been sent to oversee something far more complex and sinister than a simple expansion of their trafficking network. The apartment building where Anna and her charges were housed sat in Prague's Vinohrady district, a respectable middle-class neighborhood where their presence wouldn't attract unwanted attention. But within days of their arrival, Anna realized that this wasn't just another trafficking operation. The White Ladies were experimenting with something they called cultural infiltration, using their victims to systematically corrupt and compromise Czech society from within. The 12 women under Anna's supervision had been chosen not just for their physical attributes or level of dependency, but for specific skills and backgrounds that made them ideal agents of social disruption. There was Marie, a former university student who spoke fluent Czech and could pass as a local intellectual. There was Ingrid, whose family connections gave her access to Prague's business community. There was Sophia, a trained nurse who understood how to distribute drugs through medical channels. Each woman had been assigned a specific role in what Margaret von Siemens called the Prague experiment. Rather than simply selling their services to individual clients, they were tasked with embedding themselves in Czech institutions and using their positions to spread both drug addiction and political corruption throughout the city's power structure. Marie was enrolled at Charles University, where she began hosting study groups that gradually introduced students to recreational drug use. Her academic credentials and sophisticated manner made her seem like a natural leader among Prague's intellectual youth. Within months, she had cultivated a network of young Czechs who saw drug experimentation as a form of rebellion against traditional authority. Ingrid used her business connections to establish what appeared to be a legitimate import company, but which actually served as a front for smuggling heroin and cocaine from German pharmaceutical factories. Her respectable appearance and family name gave her access to customs officials, bank managers, and government regulators who never suspected that she was systematically corrupting the very institutions they represented. Sophia's medical background allowed her to infiltrate Prague's healthcare patient system, where she began identifying who might be vulnerable to addiction and doctors who might be willing to participate in illegal prescription schemes. Her knowledge of pharmaceutical chemistry made her invaluable in adapting German-produced drugs for local distribution networks. Anna's role was to coordinate these activities while maintaining the women's drug dependencies and ensuring their loyalty to the White Ladies organization. But as weeks turned into months, she began to see patterns that disturbed even her hardened sensibilities. The Prague experiment wasn't just about making money or expanding criminal operations. It was about something much more ambitious and destructive. Margaret's correspondence, which Anna was required to encrypt and transmit back to Berlin, revealed that the White Ladies saw Czech society as a testing ground for techniques that could eventually be applied throughout Eastern Europe. They were studying how quickly democratic institutions could be corrupted, how effectively addiction could be used to control entire social classes, how foreign criminal organizations could manipulate local politics without being detected. The data being collected in Prague included detailed analyses of which segments of Czech society were most vulnerable to corruption, which government positions provided the greatest access to sensitive information, which cultural institutions had the most influence over public opinion. This wasn't criminal activity. It was intelligence gathering on a scale that rivaled government spy networks. But Anna wasn't the only one conducting surveillance in Prague. Czech police had noticed the sudden influx of German women into their city, and they had begun their own investigation into what appeared to be an organized infiltration effort. More ominously, Nazi agents had followed the Eastern Routes operations across the border and were documenting everything the White Ladies were doing for their own purposes. The Nazis saw the Prague experiment as proof of their theories about how Jewish and foreign influences were systematically corrupting European societies. They were particularly interested in the White Ladies' techniques for using addiction to control educated professionals, methods that could potentially be reversed and used to eliminate undesirable elements from German society. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Helena Kruger was facing her own crisis. Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's research had finally attracted the attention of international law enforcement agencies, and several European countries were beginning to coordinate their efforts to combat human trafficking networks. The isolation and chaos that had protected the White Ladies for nearly a decade were rapidly disappearing. Helena's response was characteristically brutal. She decided to eliminate the threat by destroying not just Hirschfeld's research, but Hirschfeld himself and everyone associated with his institute. The plan involved using the White Lady's most addicted and desperate victims to stage what would appear to be a drug-fueled attack by deranged prostitutes on a respected scientific institution. The attack on the Institute for Sexual Research took place on March 15th, 1927. 5 women, so heavily drugged that they could barely speak coherently, forced their way into the building during daylight hours and began destroying research files, equipment, and anything else they could reach. When police arrived, they found what appeared to be a random act of violence by mentally unstable drug addicts. But Hirschfeld had anticipated something like this. He had already moved his most sensitive research to secure locations, and he had prepared detailed testimony about the White Ladies organization that was delivered to international authorities immediately after the attack. Rather than silencing him, Helena's assault had given Hirschfeld's research even greater credibility and urgency. The international response was swift and coordinated. Within weeks, police agencies across Europe were conducting simultaneous raids on suspected trafficking networks. Banks were freezing accounts linked to suspected criminal organizations. Border controls were being strengthened to prevent the movement of victims between countries. Anna received coded warnings from Berlin that the entire Eastern Route operation was in jeopardy. She was instructed to begin liquidating assets, a euphemism that meant eliminating evidence and witnesses who might implicate the White Ladies organization in international crimes. The liquidation process began with the women who had been part of the Prague experiment. One by one, they began disappearing from their assigned positions. Some were found dead in apparent suicides. Others simply vanished without a trace. A few were discovered in hospitals, catatonic from massive drug overdoses that had destroyed their ability to form coherent memories. Anna realized that she was witnessing the systematic murder of women who had served the White Ladies faithfully for years. More terrifyingly, she understood that her own knowledge of the organization's operations made her a liability that would eventually need to be eliminated as well. Her survival instincts, sharpened by years of navigating criminal hierarchies, told her that her only chance was to disappear before the liquidation process reached her. But disappearing from the White Ladies organization required more than just running away. It required completely abandoning her identity and creating a new life in a place where the organization's reach couldn't extend. Anna's escape from Prague took place on a snowy night in early April 1927. She had spent weeks preparing, stealing money from the organization's accounts, forging travel documents, and establishing contact with smugglers who specialized in helping people disappear across international borders. Her destination was America, where she hoped to lose herself in the anonymity of New York's immigrant communities. But the journey across Europe and the Atlantic would take her through territories controlled by criminal organizations that had business relationships with the White Ladies. Every border crossing was potentially fatal. Every contact was potentially a trap. The story of Anna's escape would become legendary among the survivors of European trafficking networks. A tale of one woman's determination to break free from a system designed to make escape impossible. But her flight from the White Ladies also represented something larger and more ominous. Anna's testimony, which she would eventually provide to American authorities, contained detailed information about pharmaceutical slavery networks that extended far beyond Germany and Czechoslovakia. Her accounts describe trafficking operations in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the Soviet Union that were all connected to the system pioneered by Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger. More disturbing still, Anna's information revealed that the White Ladies had been sharing their techniques with other criminal organizations across Europe, creating a continent-wide network of pharmaceutical slavery that involved thousands of victims and generated profits that rivaled those of legitimate industries. The international scope of these operations meant that dismantling them would require unprecedented cooperation between governments that were increasingly suspicious of each other. As economic depression began spreading across Europe in the late 1920s, the political will for such cooperation was rapidly diminishing. Instead, many countries began adopting isolationist policies that inadvertently protected criminal organizations by making international law enforcement more difficult. The same nationalist movements that promised to restore moral order were actually creating conditions that allowed trafficking networks to operate with greater impunity. This contradiction would have devastating consequences as Europe moved toward the political crises of the 1930s. The techniques developed by the heroin heiresses for controlling populations through addiction and corruption would be adapted and refined by totalitarian movements that understood their potential for social engineering on a massive scale. Anna Richter's escape from the White Ladies organization marked the beginning of the end for Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger's criminal empire. But it also marked the beginning of something far more terrible, as the methods they had pioneered began spreading throughout a continent that was rapidly losing its capacity for moral resistance. The heroin heiresses had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in demonstrating how pharmaceutical wealth could be used to corrupt and control human beings. Their success would inspire imitators and adaptations that would ultimately contribute to some of the darkest chapters in European history. But that transformation was still several years away. In the spring of 1927, as Anna Richter made her desperate journey toward freedom, the White Ladies were still fighting to preserve their empire against enemies they understood, police and rival criminals, and government investigators who operated according to recognizable rules. They had not yet encountered the enemies who would ultimately destroy them. Political movements that understood exactly how to use the chaos and moral breakdown the heroin heiresses had helped create, and who had far more ambitious plans for reshaping European society than anything Margaret and Helena had ever imagined. The summer of 1927 brought no relief to Margaret von Siemens. Only the growing realization that her pharmaceutical empire was CR within. The international humbling from pressure following Hirschfeld's revelations had forced her to abandon 3 of her major production facilities, while the loss of Anna Richter and the Prague experiment had cost her millions in destroyed infrastructure and eliminated personnel. But Margaret was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. As reports reached her of coordinated police raids across Europe, she made a decision that would prove to be both her most ruthless and her most desperate. If the White Ladies organization was going to survive, it would need to evolve beyond anything it had been before. It would need to become something that could operate independently of geography, governments, and even the women who had created it. The plan she developed was called the Eternal Network, and it represented the culmination of everything Margaret had learned about human control during her decade in the criminal underworld. Rather than relying on traditional trafficking methods that required physical control of victims, the Eternal Network would be built on what she called voluntary enslavement, a system so sophisticated that victims would actively participate in their own exploitation without recognizing what was happening to them. The key insight behind voluntary enslavement was that people could be controlled more effectively through their desires than through their fears. Instead of kidnapping vulnerable women and forcing them into addiction, the Eternal Network would identify women who were already seeking escape from their circumstances and offer them exactly what they thought they wanted. The recruitment process began with careful psychological profiling. Margaret's agents would spend weeks studying potential targets, learning their backgrounds, their insecurities, their dreams, and their weaknesses. They would identify women who were intelligent enough, valuable, but to be desperate enough to be manipulable. Women who had lost their families in the war, who had been betrayed by lovers, who had failed in their careers, who felt isolated from society. Once a target was selected, the approach was gradual and seemingly accidental. The woman might encounter a charming stranger at a cafe who shared her interests in literature or art. She might receive an unexpected job offer that seemed perfectly suited to her skills. She might be invited to social events where she met fascinating people who made her feel special and appreciated. These initial contacts were always handled by women who had themselves been processed through earlier versions of the White Lady system. They understood exactly how to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities because they had experienced the same manipulation themselves. But unlike traditional trafficking victims, these recruiters believed they were helping other women find the same freedom and sophistication they thought they had achieved. The genius of the Eternal Network was that it made exploitation feel like empowerment. Women who joined the organization were told they were becoming part of an exclusive society of independent females who had rejected conventional morality in favor of personal freedom. They were encouraged to see drug use as sophisticated rebellion, sexual promiscuity as liberation from bourgeois constraints, and criminal activity as justified resistance against an oppressive social system. Helena Kruger had initially opposed the Eternal Network concept, arguing that their traditional methods had proven effective and profitable. But as pressure from law enforcement intensified, she began to see the advantages of Margaret's approach. Voluntary participants were less likely to escape or betray the organization because they believed they were benefiting from their involvement. They were also more effective at recruiting new members because their enthusiasm appeared genuine. The first test of the Eternal Network took place in Vienna, where Margaret had established connections with the city's thriving artistic community. Vienna in the late 1920s was experiencing its own version of the cultural experimentation that had characterized Berlin earlier in the decade, and the city's bohemian circles provide cover for recruitment activities. The operation began with the establishment of what appeared to be an artist's salon, a gathering place where writers, painters, and musicians could meet to discuss their work and share ideas. The salon was hosted by Claudia Brenner, a woman who had been processed through the White Lady system, but who genuinely believed she had found freedom and purpose in her new role as a cultural facilitator. Claudia had been recruited 3 years earlier, when she was struggling to establish herself as a painter in Munich. Her family had disowned her for refusing an arranged marriage, and she was surviving by selling her artwork on street corners while living in a series of increasingly squalid boarding houses. When Helena's agents approached her with an offer to fund her artistic career in exchange for hosting social events, it seemed like salvation. Over the course of 18 months, Claudia had been gradually introduced to the White Lady's pharmaceutical products and sexual services network. But the process had been so carefully managed that she experienced each step as a personal choice rather than external coercion. When she began using drugs, it was presented as artistic experimentation. When she started sleeping with wealthy men, it was framed as sophisticated relationships with patrons who appreciated her intellect as well as her beauty. By the time Claudia arrived in Vienna to establish the artist's salon, she had become a true believer in the White Lady's philosophy of female liberation through rejection of conventional morality. She genuinely believed she was helping other women achieve the same freedom she had found, and her sincere enthusiasm made her incredibly effective at recruitment. The Vienna Quickly Salon became a gathering place for the city's most talented and ambitious young women. Painters who couldn't afford proper studios, writers who struggled to find publishers, musicians who performed in coffee houses for tips. All of them were looking for something more than their current circumstances provided, and Claudia offered them a community of like-minded individuals who understood their frustrations. The began salon's activities innocently enough. Weekly gatherings featured discussions of art, literature, and philosophy, along with performances by talented members of the group. But gradually, other elements were introduced, exotic drugs that were said to enhance creativity, wealthy patrons who were genuinely interested in supporting artistic endeavors, opportunities to travel to other cities where similar salons were being established. Within 6 months, the Vienna Salon had processed nearly 50 young women through various stages of the Eternal Network system. Some became recruiters themselves, establishing similar operations in other cities. Others became specialized service providers, using their artistic talents to create sophisticated entertainment for wealthy clients. a few became managers, overseeing the financial and logistical aspects of the organization's operations. But the most valuable participants were those who became what Margaret called cultural ambassadors, women who used their positions in legitimate artistic and intellectual communities to normalize and promote the lifestyle that the Eternal Network represented. These women didn't see themselves as criminals or prostitutes. They saw themselves as pioneers of a new form of female independence that challenged traditional social restrictions. The success of the Vienna experiment convinced Margaret that the Eternal Network concept could be scaled across Europe and beyond. By early 1928, similar operations were being established in Paris, Rome, Budapest, and even London. Each location was carefully selected for its cultural sophistication and its population of educated but economically vulnerable young women. The expansion of the Eternal Network required unprecedented coordination and communication between different cells of the organization. Margarete developed an elaborate system of coded correspondence that allowed her to maintain control over operations across multiple countries while minimizing the risk of detection by law enforcement agencies. But the complexity of managing such a widespread network also created new vulnerabilities. The more people who were involved in the organization, the greater the chance that someone would recognize the true nature of what they were participating in. The more cities where operations were established, the greater the risk that local authorities would notice patterns that connected seemingly independent criminal activities. Most dangerously, the Eternal Network's emphasis on voluntary participation meant that its members retained more independence and critical thinking than traditional trafficking victims. While this made them more effective at recruitment and management tasks, it also made them more likely to question the organization's activities and potentially more willing to cooperate with authorities if they became disillusioned. Anna Richter's escape and subsequent testimony to American authorities had already demonstrated how devastating insider knowledge could be to the White Lady's operations. If multiple participants in the Eternal Network decided to defect simultaneously, they could provide law enforcement agencies with enough information to dismantle the entire organization. Margaret's solution to this problem was characteristically ruthless. She implemented what she called the insurance system of mutual, a network blackmail and dependency that made defection extremely costly for any individual participant. Every member of the Eternal Network was required to provide compromising information about other members, creating a web of mutual vulnerability that discouraged betrayal. The insurance system also included more direct forms of control. Family members of key participants were identified and monitored, creating implicit threats that could be activated if necessary. Financial assets were structured in ways that made them inaccessible to individuals who left the organization. Most importantly, the gradual drug dependencies that were cultivated in all participants created physical and psychological needs that could only be met within the network. By late 1928, the Eternal Network had become a self-sustaining system that generated enormous profits while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Its participants genuinely believed they were part of a revolutionary movement for female liberation, while actually functioning as components in one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in European history. But the very success of Margaret's creation was attracting attention from quarters that she had not anticipated. The Nazi Party's intelligence apparatus had been monitoring the White Lady's activities for years, but the Eternal Network's emphasis on cultural infiltration and ideological manipulation made it particularly interesting to political movements that understood the power of propaganda and social engineering. Nazi theorists saw in the Eternal Network a perfect example of what they claimed was happening throughout European society. Wealthy Jewish criminals, they argued, were systematically corrupting Gentile women through drugs and sexual exploitation, using cultural institutions to spread moral decay that would ultimately destroy Christian civilization. But the Nazis were also fascinated by the Eternal Network's methods. The techniques that Margaret had developed for voluntary enslavement could potentially be reversed and used to create voluntary loyalty to political movements. The psychological profiling methods used for recruitment could be applied to identify and target political opponents. The communication systems and organizational structures could be adapted for political organizing on a massive scale. Heinrich Himmler himself had begun collecting detailed reports about the White Ladies' operations, not because he wanted to shut them down, but because he wanted to understand how their methods could be incorporated into the Nazi Party's own apparatus for social control. The Heroin Heiresses had become unwitting teachers for a political movement that would ultimately prove far more ruthless and systematic than anything they had ever imagined. Meanwhile, legitimate authorities were also beginning to understand the true scope of what the White Ladies had created. International police cooperation was improving, despite the political tensions that were building across Europe. New investigative techniques were being developed specifically to combat sophisticated criminal networks that operated across national boundaries. The League of Nations had established a special commission to study human trafficking, and their preliminary reports were identifying patterns that pointed directly toward the Eternal Network's operations. American law enforcement agencies were sharing Anna Richter's testimony with their European counterparts, providing crucial insights into how slavery networks function pharmaceutically. Most ominously for Margaret and Helena, several European governments were beginning to coordinate their regulatory oversight of pharmaceutical manufacturing. The legal drug production facilities that provided the foundation for the White Ladies' criminal activities were facing unprecedented scrutiny and oversight. The walls were closing in on the Heroin Heiresses from multiple directions simultaneously. Law enforcement pressure was making their traditional operations increasingly difficult to maintain. Political extremist movements were targeting them as symbols of social decay, while simultaneously studying their methods for potential adaptation. Economic changes were reducing the pool of vulnerable women who could be recruited into trafficking networks. But perhaps most dangerously, the Eternal Network's own success was creating internal contradictions that threatened to tear the organization apart from within. The women who had been processed through the voluntary enslavement system were becoming increasingly sophisticated and independent, making them harder to control through traditional methods. Some of the cultural ambassadors were beginning to question whether their lifestyle really represented the liberation they had been promised. A few of the salon managers were starting to notice discrepancies between the organization's stated philosophy and its actual practices. Several of the recruiters were becoming uncomfortable with the psychological manipulation they were required to perform on new targets. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the White Ladies organization, but the future direction of criminal networks throughout Europe. The techniques that Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger had pioneered were about to be tested against forces that understood exactly how dangerous those techniques could be when wielded by truly ruthless hands. And in the center of this approaching storm was Claudia Brenner, the artist who had become a true believer in pharmaceutical liberation, but who was about to discover that even the most sophisticated system of voluntary enslavement could not survive the collision between criminal ambition and political fanaticism that was about to reshape the European continent. The autumn of 1928 brought disturbing news to Claudia Brenner's Vienna salon. 3 of her most promising recruits had disappeared within a single week, leaving behind only hastily written notes claiming they had decided to return to their families. But Claudia knew these women well enough to recognize that their sudden departures made no sense. Maria had been estranged from her family for years. Sophie had no family to return to, and Ingrid had been planning to open her own salon in Prague. What Claudia didn't know was that all 3 women had been contacted by agents working for a new player in the European underworld, one that represented a threat unlike anything the White Ladies had faced before. These agents didn't offer money or drugs or social advancement. Instead, they offered something far more appealing to women who had grown tired of the constant manipulation, AMB, and moral acuity that defined their lives within the Eternal Network. They offered redemption. The organization behind these recruitment efforts called itself the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose, and it presented itself as a religious movement dedicated to rescuing women who had been corrupted by modern society's moral decay. The sisterhood's message was carefully crafted to appeal specifically to women who had been processed through systems the eternal network, women like who retained enough intelligence and self-awareness to recognize that their current lives were not providing the fulfillment they had been promised. But the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose was not what it appeared to be. Behind its religious facade was an operation funded and directed by Nazi intelligence services, designed to infiltrate and ultimately networks destroy criminal that the party saw as both ideologically threatening and tactically useful. The Sisterhood's real purpose was to identify, catalogue, and eventually eliminate the women detail who possessed knowledge of European trafficking operations. The genius of the Nazi approach was that it offered genuine spiritual and psychological healing to women who desperately needed it, while simultaneously gathering intelligence that could be used to destroy the criminal organizations they were fleeing. Women who joined the Sisterhood underwent a carefully designed rehabilitation process that helped them overcome their drug dependencies and psychological trauma, but which also included extensive debriefing sessions where they provided detailed information about their former lives. Maria, Sophie, and Ingrid had all been recruited through the same method. Each had been approached by a woman who claimed to be a former trafficking victim who had found salvation through the Sisterhood's programs. These recruiters shared stories that were carefully calibrated to resonate with each target's specific experiences and vulnerabilities. The recruiters spoke of finding peace after years of exploitation, of discovering genuine purpose after being manipulated by criminal organizations that had promised liberation but delivered only sophisticated forms of slavery. They offered not just escape from the eternal network, but transformation into something better than what the women had been before their involvement with criminal organizations. The rehabilitation centers where new Sisterhood members were processed were located in remote areas of Bavaria and Austria, far from the urban environments where trafficking networks operated. The facilities appeared to be legitimate religious retreats, complete with chapels, meditation gardens, and dormitories designed to house women seeking spiritual renewal. But the isolation of these centers served purposes beyond spiritual contemplation. Women who entered Sisterhood facilities were cut off from all contact with their former lives while they underwent intensive psychological reprogramming. The process was designed to replace their loyalty to criminal organizations with fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology, though this transformation was accomplished so gradually that most participants never recognized what was happening to them. The debriefing sessions where former trafficking victims provided information about their criminal experiences were presented as therapeutic exercises designed to help them process their trauma. Trained interrogators posed as counselors and spiritual advisors, using sophisticated psychological techniques to extract detailed intelligence while maintaining the appearance of providing genuine help. Within 18 months of its establishment, the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose had processed nearly 200 women who had been involved with various European trafficking networks. The intelligence they provided gave Nazi authorities unprecedented insight into how these organizations operated, who controlled them, where their assets were hidden, and how they could be most effectively disrupted. But the Sisterhood's activities were not limited to intelligence gathering. Women who completed the rehabilitation process were often deployed as double agents, sent back into criminal networks with new identities and carefully constructed cover stories. These operatives were instructed to work their way into positions of trust within trafficking organizations, where they could gather additional intelligence and, when necessary, sabotage operations from within. Claudia Brenner first became aware that something was seriously wrong with her Vienna salon when she discovered that several of her most trusted associates had been asking unusual questions about the organization's financial structure and leadership hierarchy. These were women she had personally recruited and trained, women who had shown no previous signs of disloyalty or suspicion. Her instincts, sharpened by years of navigating criminal hierarchies, told her that her salon had been infiltrated by hostile agents, but she couldn't determine who was responsible or what their ultimate objectives might be. The questions being asked were too sophisticated to come from ordinary law enforcement agencies, but too specific to be the work of rival criminal organizations. Claudia's attempts to investigate the infiltration of her operation led her to make contact with other salon managers across Europe, women who were reporting similar problems with trusted associates, asking suspicious questions, and key personnel disappearing without explanation. The pattern was too widespread to be coincidental, but too subtle to represent an ordinary law enforcement crackdown. The salon managers' communications were intercepted by Nazi intelligence services, who used the information to map the entire structure of the Eternal Network's European operations. Every attempt by the White Ladies organization to investigate the security breaches provided additional intelligence that could be used to plan more sophisticated infiltration and disruption operations. By early 1929, Margarete von Siemens was receiving reports from across Europe indicating that her carefully constructed criminal empire was under systematic attack by an enemy that remained completely invisible. Operations that had functioned smoothly for years were suddenly experiencing unexplained failures. Key personnel were disappearing or displaying signs of psychological instability. Financial assets were being frozen by authorities who seemed to possess impossibly detailed information about the organization's activities. Margaret's response was to implement emergency security protocols that had been developed for use in extreme crisis situations. All communications between different parts of the organization were suspended. Personnel were forbidden from traveling between cities without authorization. New explicit recruitment activities were halted while existing operations were thoroughly audited for signs defensive of infiltration. But these two measures came late to prevent the damage that had already been done. The Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose had succeeded in placing operatives throughout the Eternal Network's European operations, and these agents were now in position to coordinate the systematic destruction of everything the White Ladies had built. The first major blow came in Paris, where a coordinated police raid shut down 3 different salon operations simultaneously. The raids were executed with precision that indicated detailed advanced knowledge of the facility's layouts, security measures, and personnel schedules. Within hours, over 60 women had been arrested, and massive quantities of drugs and financial records had been seized. Similar raids followed in rapid succession across Europe. Vienna, Rome, Budapest, and London all saw their salon operations dismantled by authorities who possessed intelligence that could only have come from sources deep within the organizations themselves. The carefully constructed facade of cultural sophistication that had protected the Eternal Network was stripped away, revealing the criminal reality beneath. Helena Kruger's response to the crisis was characteristically violent. She ordered the immediate of anyone elimination who might possess information that could be used against the organization, including many women who had served the White Ladies faithfully for years. The liquidation campaign was brutal and indiscriminate, targeting not just suspectorators, but anyone whose infilt knowledge made them a potential liability. But Helena's massacre of potential witnesses only provided additional evidence that Nazi intelligence services could use to justify even more aggressive action against the remnants of the White Ladies organization. The Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose began publicizing stories about the mass murder of trafficking victims, presenting them as evidence of the moral depravity that characterized Jewish criminal organizations. The propaganda campaign that accompanied the destruction of the Eternal Network was carefully designed to serve multiple purposes. It provided justification for the Nazi Party's increasingly radical rhetoric about Jewish corruption and moral decay. It demonstrated the effectiveness of Nazi intelligence operations to potential political opponents, and it created public support for more aggressive government action against organized crime. Most importantly, the campaign established a narrative framework that could be used to justify future political actions. If Jewish criminals were willing to murder hundreds of women To protect their illegal profits, Nazi propagandists argued, what wouldn't they do to maintain their supposed control over German society? The Heroin Heiresses had become symbols of a conspiracy that allegedly threatened the very survival of European civilization. Claudia Brenner managed to escape the Vienna raids, but only by abandoning everything she had built over the previous 2 years. She fled to Switzerland with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a small amount of cash she had hidden for emergencies. The sophisticated artistic community she had created, the cultural movement she had genuinely believed was liberating oppressed women, the identity she had constructed over years of careful work, all of it was gone. But Claudia's escape was temporary. The Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose had detailed information about every aspect of her background, and Nazi agents were already tracking her movements through their networks of informants and collaborators. Within weeks of her arrival in Switzerland, she was contacted by a woman who claimed to be another refugee from the destroyed Vienna salon. They'd Claudia Shelterwoman offer an in-establishing assistance, a new identity that would allow her to disappear permanently from the of both attention criminal organizations and law offer enforcement agencies. But that came with a price. In exchange for protection, Claudia would be required to provide detailed testimony about the White Ladies organization's structure, methods, and leadership. Claudia's decision to accept this offer marked the final betrayal of the organization that had shaped her adult life. The information she provided gave Nazi intelligence services the last pieces of evidence they needed to completely destroy what remained of Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger's criminal empire. But Claudia's testimony would also make her complicit in something far worse than anything she had experienced as a trafficking victim. The intelligence she provided would be used not just to arrest criminals, but to target thousands of innocent people who would be classified as undesirable elements in the new society that Nazi ideology promised to create. The heroin heiresses of Weimar Berlin had built their empire by exploiting the chaos and moral breakdown that followed Germany's defeat in World War I. Now that empire was being systematically dismantled by political forces that understood exactly how to use the techniques the White Ladies had pioneered, but which had far more ambitious goals than simple criminal profit. The story of pharmaceutical slavery in Weimar Germany was approaching its climax. But that climax would not bring justice for the thousands of women who had been exploited by the heroin heiresses. Instead, it would bring something far more terrible, a transformation of criminal techniques into political tools that would reshape the entire European continent. The spring of 1929 found Margaret von Siemens barricaded in her Berlin mansion, surrounded by bodyguards who had once served the Kaiser's personal security detail. The walls of her study were covered with maps showing the locations of destroyed operations across Europe, each red pin representing millions of marks in lost revenue and years of careful planning reduced to ash. But Margaret wasn't broken. If anything, the systematic destruction of her empire had crystallized something cold and calculating in her mind. She had built the White Ladies from nothing once before, and she was prepared to do it again. But this new organization would be different. It would be harder, more ruthless, and completely invisible to the enemies who had destroyed her previous creation. The plan she developed was called the Phoenix Protocol, and it represented everything Margaret had learned about survival in a world where political extremism was rapidly consuming traditional criminal enterprises. If Nazi intelligence services wanted to play games of infiltration and psychological manipulation, she would show them what those techniques looked like when wielded by someone who had spent a decade perfecting them. The Phoenix Protocol began with a complete abandonment of the Eternal Network's emphasis on voluntary participation. Margaret had concluded that giving her victims any degree of independence or critical thinking ability was a fatal weakness that her enemies could exploit. The new organization would return to the brutal simplicity of complete control through addiction, fear, and isolation. But the Phoenix Protocol also incorporated everything Margaret had learned from studying her enemies' methods. The Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose had succeeded by offering genuine healing to women who desperately needed it. then using that healing process to extract intelligence and create loyal operatives. Margaret would reverse this approach, using apparent healing and redemption as weapons against the very people who had destroyed her empire. The first phase of the Phoenix Protocol involved identifying women who had been processed through sisterhood rehabilitation centers. These were former trafficking victims who believed they had found salvation through Nazi-sponsored programs, but who retained detailed knowledge of criminal networks that could be valuable to a sufficiently ruthless exploitation. Margaret's agents began approaching these women with carefully crafted stories about new opportunities for genuine independence and moral redemption. They presented themselves as representatives of an international women's rights organization that was working to expose and destroy the criminal networks that had exploited so many innocent victims. The women targeted by these recruitment efforts were told that they could help prevent other women from experiencing the trauma they had endured by providing information that would be used to shut down remaining trafficking operations. They were promised positions in legitimate businesses, comfortable housing, and the satisfaction of knowing they were contributing to justice for crimes that had been committed against them. But the International Women's Rights Organization was entirely fictitious. The legitimate businesses were fronts for new criminal enterprises, and the information these women provided was being used not to shut down trafficking networks, but to rebuild them with improved security measures and more sophisticated operational methods. Helena Kruger had initially opposed the Phoenix Protocol, arguing that targeting former sisterhood members was unnecessarily dangerous. These women had connections to Nazi intelligence services that could expose the rebuilt organization to the same infiltration techniques that had destroyed the Eternal Network. But Margaret's analysis of their situation had convinced her that conventional approaches to rebuilding their criminal empire were impossible. Every traditional recruitment method had been compromised by enemy intelligence services. Every established operational protocol had been studied and countered by hostile forces. The only way to survive was to turn their enemies' own weapons against them. The genius of targeting former sisterhood members was that it allowed the White Ladies to study Nazi intelligence techniques from the inside, while simultaneously corrupting the very women those techniques had been designed to control. Every former trafficking victim who was re-recruited into criminal networks provided detailed information about rehabilitation methods to be used to counter security protocols and operational procedures that could foil future infiltration attempts. More importantly, these women could serve as double agents within the Nazi intelligence apparatus itself. Their apparent rehabilitation and genuine gratitude toward their supposed saviors made them ideal candidates for positions within sisterhood operations. Once placed in these positions, they could gather intelligence about Nazi plans while subtly sabotaging the programs that had been designed to destroy criminal networks. The first successful Phoenix Protocol operation took place in Munich, where Margaret's agents approached a woman named Elizabeth Hoffman, who had been processed through a sisterhood rehabilitation center 18 months earlier. Elizabeth had been one of Helena's most valuable trafficking victims before her apparent rescue and redemption, and her knowledge of White Ladies' operations made her an attractive target for recruitment. Elizabeth's approach to the Phoenix Protocol agents was initially suspicious. She had been warned by her sisterhood counselors that criminal organizations might attempt to re-recruit former victims, and she had been trained to recognize and resist such attempts. But the recruitment pitch she received was unlike anything her rehabilitation had prepared her for. The agents told Elizabeth that they represented an organization called the International Committee for Women's Justice, which was working to expose corruption within religious and charitable organizations that claimed to help trafficking victims. They showed her documentation suggesting that the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose was actually a front for political extremists who were using former victims to gather intelligence for purposes that had nothing to do with justice or healing. The documentation was sophisticated and convincing because much of it was true. The Sisterhood was indeed a front for Nazi intelligence operations, and former trafficking victims were being used to gather information for political rather than humanitarian purposes. The only deception was the claim that the International Committee represented a legitimate alternative to the corrupt system Elizabeth had unknowingly become part of. Elizabeth's recruitment into the Phoenix Protocol was accomplished over the course of several months, using psychological techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything the original White Ladies organization had employed. Rather than simply exploiting her vulnerabilities, Margaret's agents helped Elizabeth recognize and overcome some of her genuine psychological problems, while simultaneously creating new dependencies that would ensure her loyalty. The process began with legitimate therapy sessions that helped Elizabeth deal with trauma from her original trafficking experiences. But these sessions also included subtle forms of ideological conditioning that gradually convinced her that conventional society was irredeemably corrupt, and that only radical action could protect vulnerable women from future exploitation. Elizabeth was introduced to other women who had supposedly been rescued from various forms of exploitation, and who had dedicated their lives to fighting the systems that had victimized them. These women shared stories of corruption they had discovered within charitable organizations, government agencies, and religious institutions that claimed to help victims but actually served the interests of powerful criminals and political extremists. The community Elizabeth was being introduced to appeared to offer everything the sisterhood had promised but failed to deliver. Genuine sisterhood among women who understood her experiences, meaningful work that could prevent other women from suffering as she had suffered, and most importantly, the power to strike back at the forces that had exploited her vulnerability for their own purposes. But Elizabeth's new community was itself a carefully constructed deception. The women who shared their stories of corruption and exploitation were either paid actresses or former trafficking victims who had been processed through earlier phases of the Phoenix Protocol. The meaningful work she was being offered was actually preparation for participation in criminal activities that were far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything she had experienced during her original trafficking. The International Committee for Women's Justice was a front organization that existed solely to provide cover for the rebuilding of the White Ladies' criminal empire. Elizabeth's apparent rescue from Nazi manipulation was actually her recruitment into a system that was designed to be far more controlling and exploitative than anything she had previously experienced. By late 1929, the Phoenix Protocol had successfully recruited nearly 50 former sisterhood members across Germany and Austria. These women provided Margaret with detailed intelligence about Nazi operations, while simultaneously serving as the foundation for a new criminal network that was specifically designed to be immune to the Eternal Network. The new infiltration techniques that had destroyed the organization operated according to cellular structures that had been borrowed from political resistance movements. Each cell contained no more than 5 members, and no individual cell had knowledge of more than 2 other cells in the network. Communications between cells were handled through elaborate systems of coded messages and dead drops that made systematic infiltration virtually impossible. Most importantly, the Phoenix Protocol incorporated what Margaret called ideological immunization techniques that were designed to make her operatives resistant to the psychological manipulation methods that enemy intelligence services had used so effectively against the Eternal Network. Every member of the new organization underwent extensive training in recognizing and countering interrogation techniques, infiltration methods, and propaganda campaigns. The training process was disguised as education in women's rights activism and social justice organizing. Members learned to identify corrupt institutions and exploitative relationships, but they were also taught that these same analytical skills could be used to recognize when they themselves were being targeted for manipulation by hostile forces. Elizabeth Hoffman became one of the Phoenix Protocol's most successful operatives, using her position within a legitimate women's rights organization to recruit new members while gathering intelligence about law enforcement activities. Her apparent commitment to helping trafficking victims made her an ideal cover identity for criminal activities, while her knowledge of Nazi intelligence methods made her valuable for counter-surveillance operations. But Elizabeth's success also illustrated the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Phoenix Protocol. The more sophisticated and independent Margaret's operatives became, the more likely they were to recognize the true nature of the organization they were serving. The ideological immunization that protected them from enemy manipulation also made them capable of seeing through the deceptions that kept them loyal to the White Ladies. This contradiction would eventually prove fatal to the Phoenix Protocol, but in late 1929, it remained a theoretical problem that Margaret believed she could manage through careful personnel selection and operational security. The immediate priority was rebuilding her criminal empire quickly enough to take advantage of the economic chaos that was beginning to engulf Europe. The stock market crash in New York had sent shockwaves through European financial markets, creating exactly the kind of desperation and social instability that had allowed the White Ladies to thrive in the aftermath of World War I. Millions of people were losing their jobs, their savings, and their hope for the future. The political extremism that had destroyed Margaret's previous organization was also creating new opportunities for criminal enterprises that could adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Helena Kruger had spent the months following the Eternal Network's destruction establishing new supply chains for pharmaceutical products. The legitimate drug manufacturing facilities that had provided the foundation for the White Ladies' original operations were now under heavy government oversight, but the economic crisis was creating new opportunities for black market production and distribution. Factory workers who had lost their jobs were willing to participate in illegal manufacturing operations if the pay was sufficient. Chemists who had been laid off from legitimate pharmaceutical companies were available for recruitment into criminal enterprises. Government inspectors who were facing salary cuts were increasingly susceptible to bribery and corruption. Helena's new production network was smaller than the White Ladies' original facilities, but it was also more flexible and harder for authorities to detect. Instead of operating large centralized factories, she established dozens of small laboratories that could be quickly relocated if they attracted unwanted attention. Instead of relying on traditional distribution channels, she created networks of unemployed workers who were desperate enough to accept the risks associated with drug trafficking. The combination of Margaret's Phoenix Protocol recruitment methods and Helena's rebuilt production capabilities created the foundation for a new criminal organization that was far more dangerous than anything the Heroin Heiresses had created before. The new White Ladies understood their enemies better, operated with greater security consciousness, and possessed ideological motivations that went beyond simple profit-seeking. But they were also operating in a political environment that was becoming increasingly hostile to the kind of criminal enterprises they represented. The Nazi Party was gaining political power throughout Germany, and their propaganda campaigns against Jewish criminals and moral corruption were creating public support for increasingly violent measures against organized crime. More ominously, the techniques that Margaret and Helena had pioneered for controlling human beings through addiction and psychological manipulation were being studied and adapted by political movements that had far more ambitious goals than criminal profit. The Heroin Heiresses had succeeded in rebuilding their empire, but they had also created the weapons that would eventually be used to destroy not just their organization, but the entire social order they had helped corrupt. The Phoenix Protocol's first major operation was scheduled for New Year's Eve, 1929, and it would represent everything Margaret had learned about survival in a world where criminal enterprises had to compete with political extremism for control over human beings. But the operation would also mark the beginning of the end for the Heroin Heiresses, because the forces they were about to confront had learned to use their own methods better than they ever could. Elizabeth Hoffman stood in the shadows of Berlin's Potsdamer Platz, watching the crowds of revelers who had gathered to celebrate the arrival of 1930. The square was filled with people who were desperately trying to forget the economic catastrophe that had destroyed their previous lives, using alcohol, drugs, and reckless behavior to numb themselves against an uncertain future. But Elizabeth wasn't there to celebrate. She was conducting the final reconnaissance for an operation that would determine whether the Phoenix Protocol could successfully challenge the forces that had destroyed the original White Ladies organization. The target was a Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose recruitment center that had been established in a building just 3 blocks from where she stood. The operation Elizabeth was preparing had multiple objectives that reflected the sophisticated strategic thinking that now characterized the rebuilt White Ladies organization. The primary goal was to rescue a dozen women who had been processed through sisterhood rehabilitation programs and were now being used as intelligence operatives against remaining criminal networks. But the rescue operation was also designed to send a message to Nazi intelligence services that the Heroin Heiresses were not defeated and would not tolerate continued interference with their activities. Most importantly, the operation would gather intelligence about sisterhood methods and security procedures that could be used to protect the Phoenix Protocol from future infiltration attempts. Elizabeth's role in the operation was to use her apparent credentials as a women's rights activist to gain access to the Sisterhood facility during a New Year's Eve charity event. Once inside, she would identify the women targeted for rescue while gathering information about the building's layout and security measures. The other members of Elizabeth's cell would create diversions that would allow the targeted women to escape during the chaos that would follow the charity event. But the diversions were also designed to appear accidental, maintaining the Phoenix Protocol's operational security by avoiding any actions that would clearly indicate organized criminal involvement. The charity event itself was a perfect example of how Nazi intelligence services had learned to use legitimate humanitarian activities as cover for intelligence-gathering operations. The Sisterhood had invited dozens of wealthy Berlin socialites to attend a fundraising dinner that would supposedly support programs for helping trafficking victims. But the real purpose of the event was to identify potential recruits for Nazi intelligence operations. The socialites in attendance included wives and daughters of government officials, business leaders, and foreign diplomats whose connections could be valuable for intelligence-gathering purposes. The Sisterhood agents hosting the event were carefully evaluating each guest for potential recruitment or manipulation. Elizabeth's infiltration of the charity event required her to navigate a complex web of deception and counter-deception. She needed to appear genuinely committed to helping trafficking victims while actually gathering intelligence for a criminal organization. She needed to avoid detection by trained intelligence operatives while conducting surveillance activities of her own. The psychological preparation Elizabeth had received through the Phoenix Protocol proved invaluable in managing these competing demands. Her training in recognizing manipulation techniques allowed her to identify which Sisterhood agents were attempting to evaluate her for recruitment. Her education in women's rights activism provided her with convincing cover for asking detailed questions about the organization's programs and procedures. Most importantly, Elizabeth's genuine anger toward the Sisterhood for deceiving her about their true purposes gave her the emotional authenticity needed to maintain her cover identity. She wasn't just pretending to be a women's rights activist who opposed corrupt organizations that exploited trafficking victims. She actually was such an activist, even though her activism now served the interests of a criminal enterprise. The complexity of Elizabeth's psychological situation reflected the broader contradictions that characterized the rebuilt White Ladies organization. The Phoenix Protocol had created operatives who possessed genuine ideological motivations alongside their criminal objectives. These women weren't just following orders for money or drugs. They believed they were fighting against corrupt systems that had exploited and betrayed them. This ideological dimension made Phoenix Protocol operatives far more dangerous than traditional criminal employees, but it also made them less predictable and harder to control. Elizabeth's commitment to fighting corruption was real, even though her definition of corruption had been carefully shaped by Margaret's psychological conditioning techniques. As Elizabeth moved through the charity event, gathering intelligence while maintaining her cover identity, she was also conducting her own evaluation of the Sisterhood's operations. What she discovered disturbed her more than anything she had experienced during her original trafficking or her subsequent recruitment into the Phoenix Protocol. The Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose wasn't just using former trafficking victims to gather intelligence against criminal organizations. They were using these women to identify and target other women who might be vulnerable to recruitment into political movements that opposed Nazi ideology. The rehabilitation programs that had supposedly healed trafficking victims were actually training them to become recruiters for political intelligence operations. Elizabeth realized that her own rescue from the Sisterhood had been orchestrated not just to recruit her into the Phoenix Protocol, but to prevent her from being used as a weapon against other vulnerable women. The International Committee for Women's Justice might be a front for criminal activities, but it had genuinely protected her from being used for purposes that were far more sinister than anything she had experienced in traditional trafficking situations. This realization crystallized Elizabeth's commitment to the Phoenix Protocol's objectives, while simultaneously making her understand the true stakes of the conflict between the Heroin Heiresses and their Nazi opponents. This wasn't just a competition between different criminal enterprises. It was a struggle between different visions of how human beings could be controlled and exploited for organizational purposes. The Nazi approach emphasized ideological conformity and political loyalty, using rehabilitation and redemption as tools for creating fanatic devotion to party objectives. The White Ladies approach emphasized individual dependency and personal corruption, using addiction and psychological manipulation to create reliable servants who would prioritize organizational loyalty over abstract principles. Both systems were designed to destroy individual autonomy and independent moral judgment, but they represented fundamentally different strategies for achieving those goals. The conflict between them was ultimately a question of which approach to human control would prove more effective in the changing political environment of the 1930s Europe. Elizabeth's intelligence gathering at the charity event revealed that the Sisterhood was preparing to expand their operations significantly. They had received funding to establish new rehabilitation centers throughout Germany and Austria, with plans for eventual expansion into other European countries. The number of former trafficking victims being processed through their programs was increasing rapidly, creating a growing pool of potential intelligence operatives. More disturbing still, Elizabeth discovered that the Sisterhood was beginning to target women who had never been involved with trafficking networks. Young women who were simply economically desperate or politically disaffected were being recruited into programs that were designed to turn them into intelligence assets, rather than heal trauma they had actually experienced. The expansion of Sisterhood operations represented an existential threat to the Phoenix Protocol's rebuilding efforts. If Nazi intelligence services could create a large enough network of ideologically motivated female operatives, they would be able to infiltrate and destroy criminal organizations faster than those organizations could adapt their security measures. But Elizabeth's intelligence also revealed a potential weakness in the Sisterhood's approach. The rapid expansion of their operations was requiring them to recruit and train personnel who didn't possess the fanatical ideological commitment that characterized the organization's original operatives. Many of the newer Sisterhood agents were motivated primarily by economic necessity rather than political conviction. This created opportunities for the Phoenix Protocol to conduct counter-infiltration operations against the Sisterhood itself. Women who were working for Nazi intelligence services primarily for money could potentially be recruited into criminal networks that offered better compensation and more interesting work. Elizabeth's successful intelligence gathering at the charity event provided Margaret with the information needed to plan a comprehensive campaign against Sisterhood operations throughout Germany. But it also demonstrated that the conflict between the Heroin Heiresses and their Nazi opponents was entering a new phase that would require unprecedented levels of sophistication and ruthlessness from both sides. The New Year's Eve operation concluded with the successful extraction of 8 women from Sisterhood control, along with the acquisition of detailed intelligence about Nazi plans for expanding their intelligence networks throughout Europe. But the operation also marked the beginning of a shadow war that would ultimately consume both organizations and contribute to the political chaos that was engulfing the entire continent. As Elizabeth disappeared into the Berlin night, carrying information that would reshape the conflict between criminal enterprises and political extremism, she couldn't have known that she was participating in events that would ultimately lead to the destruction of everything she thought she was fighting to protect. The techniques that the Heroin Heiresses had pioneered for controlling human beings were about to be tested against political forces that understood exactly how to use those same techniques for purposes that transcended anything Margarete von Siemens and Helena Kruger had ever imagined. The winter of 1930 brought a bitter cold to Berlin that seemed to seep into the very soul of the city. Snow covered the streets like a shroud, muffling the sounds of a society teetering on the edge of complete collapse. In the depths of this frozen wasteland, Elizabeth Hoffman found herself face to face with a truth that would shatter everything she thought she understood about the war between the Heroin Heiresses and their Nazi opponents. The revelation came during what should have been a routine meeting with her Phoenix Protocol handler. Elizabeth had been summoned to a safe house in the Kreuzberg district to deliver her intelligence report about the Sisterhood charity event. But when she arrived at the designated address, she found something that made her blood run cold. The safe house had been compromised, not by police, not by Nazi agents, but by something far more sinister. The building was filled with women who appeared to be former trafficking victims, but their behavior was unlike anything Elizabeth had encountered in her years of experience with criminal networks and intelligence operations. These women moved with a mechanical precision that suggested they were operating under some form of chemical or psychological control that went far beyond anything the White Ladies had ever attempted. They spoke in monotone voices and displayed no emotional reactions to their surroundings. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be conducting some form of medical experimentation on other women who were restrained on tables throughout the building. Elizabeth's handler, a woman named Greta who had supposedly been recruited through the same Phoenix Protocol methods that had brought Elizabeth into the organization, was overseeing these activities with the calm efficiency of someone who had been conducting such experiments for years. When Greta noticed Elizabeth's horrified reaction to what she was witnessing, her response revealed the true nature of the Phoenix Protocol and the organization Elizabeth thought she had been serving. The International Committee for Women's Justice was not a criminal enterprise competing with Nazi intelligence services. It was a joint operation between the remnants of the White Ladies organization and Nazi research programs that were developing new methods for controlling human behavior through pharmaceutical and psychological manipulation. The conflict between Margarete von Siemens and the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose had been staged from the beginning. Both organizations were actually working together to develop and test techniques that could be used to control entire populations rather than just individual victims. The apparent competition between them had been designed to provide cover for experiments that neither organization could have conducted alone. Elizabeth's recruitment into the Phoenix Protocol had not been motivated by criminal profit or political ideology. She had been selected as a test subject for research into how effectively former trafficking victims could be converted into voluntary participants in even more sophisticated forms of exploitation. Every mission Elizabeth had conducted, every piece of intelligence she had gathered, every woman she had helped rescue from sisterhood facilities had been part of a controlled experiment designed to evaluate her psychological responses to different forms of manipulation and moral compromise. The women she had seen being rescued from Nazi rehabilitation centers had not been saved at all. They had been transferred from one experimental program to another, with each transfer providing researchers with opportunities to study how human beings responded to different forms of psychological conditioning. Greta explained all of this to Elizabeth with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a routine briefing. The research being conducted in the safe house was the culmination of everything both organizations had learned about controlling human behavior. The women being experimented on were being prepared for deployment in what was called the final network, a system that would make the eternal network look primitive by comparison. The final network was designed to operate on a national scale, using techniques that had been refined through years of experimentation on trafficking victims to control entire segments of the German population. The women being processed in the safe house would serve as the initial cadre of operatives for a system that would ultimately extend Nazi control into every aspect of German society. But Elizabeth's horror at these revelations was nothing compared to what Greta told her next. The experiments being conducted were not limited to German subjects. Women from across Europe were being processed through facilities like this one, with the ultimate goal of creating networks of controlled operatives who could be deployed throughout the continent. The techniques being developed were not intended solely for criminal or political purposes. They were being designed as weapons that could be used in the event of another European war, creating populations of civilians who would serve Nazi interests regardless of which armies occupied their territories. Elizabeth realized that everything she had experienced since her original trafficking had been part of a progression toward this moment. Her initial exploitation by the White Ladies, her apparent rescue by the Sisterhood, her recruitment into the Phoenix Protocol, all of it had been designed to bring her to this place where she would be offered the opportunity to become part of something that transcended anything that had come before. Greta's offer was presented as the logical culmination of Elizabeth's journey toward understanding the true nature of power and control in modern society. She could become one of the architects of the final network, using everything she had learned about manipulation and exploitation to help create a system that would bring order to the chaos that was consuming Europe. The alternative, Greta explained with clinical detachment, was to become one of the subjects being experimented on in the safe house. Elizabeth's knowledge of both criminal and intelligence operations made her too valuable to simply eliminate, but it also made her too dangerous to allow to operate independently. Elizabeth's response to this ultimatum revealed something that neither Margaret nor her Nazi collaborators had anticipated. The ideological conditioning Elizabeth had received through the Phoenix Protocol had been designed to make her resistant to enemy manipulation, but it had also given her the analytical tools needed to recognize when she herself was being manipulated by the organization she served. The training she had received in identifying corrupt institutions and exploitative relationships applied just as well to the Phoenix Protocol and the final network as it did to the Sisterhood of Sacred Purpose. Elizabeth could see that she was being offered not genuine power or purpose, but simply a more sophisticated form of the same exploitation she had been experiencing for years. Her refusal to participate in the final network represented unprecedented something in the history of the organizations that had shaped her life. For the first time, their psychological conditioning techniques had created someone who possessed both the knowledge needed to understand their true objectives and the moral clarity needed to reject those objectives. Elizabeth's escape from the Kreuzberg safe house required her to fight her way past women who had once been her colleagues and allies. But these women were no longer capable of independent thought or action. The experiments that had been conducted on them had reduced them to the level of biological machines that responded only to direct commands from their handlers. The violence Elizabeth was forced to use against these former victims of trafficking was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of her escape. She was literally fighting against women who had been destroyed by the same systems that had once threatened to destroy her. Women who could have been saved if the organizations claiming to help them had possessed any genuine commitment to human welfare. Elizabeth's flight from the safe house took her through the frozen streets of Berlin, past the clubs and cafes where she had once recruited vulnerable women into what she thought was a movement for justice and liberation. Now she understood that every woman she had approached, every story she had told, every promise she had made had been part of a system designed to feed human beings into experimental programs that reduced them to controllable resources. The guilt Elizabeth felt was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. For the first time since her original trafficking experience, she possessed both complete knowledge of the systems that had exploited her and complete freedom to choose how to respond to that knowledge. Her decision was to expose everything she had learned, regardless of the personal consequences. But exposing the collaboration between criminal organizations and Nazi research programs would require her to find allies who possessed both the power to act on her information and the moral commitment to use that power responsibly. The problem was that by 1930, such allies were becoming increasingly rare in German society. The economic collapse had created widespread desperation that made people vulnerable to any organization that offered security and purpose. The political polarization had destroyed most of the moderate institutions that might have provided alternatives to extremist solutions. Elizabeth's search for legitimate authorities who could act on her information led her to approach representatives of foreign governments, international organizations, and independent journalists who might be willing to investigate the activities she had witnessed. But what she discovered was that the collaboration between criminal and political organizations extended far beyond Germany's borders. Similar experiments were being conducted in other countries, using techniques that had been developed through the trafficking networks the heroin heiresses had established throughout Europe. The final network was not a German phenomenon. It was the culmination of a continent-wide system that had been developing for over a decade, using the chaos and instability that followed World War I to create new methods for controlling human populations. Elizabeth's attempts to expose this system put her in contact with a small network of individuals who had been conducting their own investigations into the connections between organized crime, political extremism, and human experimentation. These individuals came from diverse backgrounds: journalists, academics, government officials, religious leaders. But they shared a common recognition that something unprecedented and terrifying was emerging from the intersection of criminal enterprise and political ideology. The network Elizabeth joined was led by a woman named Dr. Sarah Goldstein, a psychiatrist who had been studying the psychological effects of trafficking and political persecution on their victims. Goldstein had been documenting patterns of behavior that suggested systematic experimentation on human subjects was being conducted throughout Europe. But she had lacked the detailed insider knowledge needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. Elizabeth's testimony provided Goldstein with the missing pieces needed to understand how criminal trafficking networks had evolved into something that resembled medical experimentation more than traditional exploitation. The techniques being used on victims had progressed far beyond simple addiction and psychological manipulation to include chemical and surgical interventions that physically altered brain function. The collaboration between Elizabeth and Goldstein produced a comprehensive report that documented the existence of what they called pharmaceutical totalitarianism, a system that used medical and chemical techniques to create populations of individuals who were incapable of independent thought or moral judgment. But their report also revealed that this system was approaching a critical threshold. The number of individuals who had been processed through various experimental programs was reaching the point where they could serve as the foundation for larger social and political transformations. The final network was not intended to remain hidden indefinitely. It was being prepared for public deployment as the foundation for a new form of government that would eliminate the possibility of political opposition or social disorder by eliminating the psychological capacity for resistance in the general population. Elizabeth and Goldstein's attempts to publicize their findings met with responses that confirmed their worst fears about how far the system they were exposing had already penetrated European society. Government officials who received their report either ignored it completely or actively worked to suppress it. Journalists who attempted to investigate their claims found themselves facing legal and financial pressures that forced them to abandon their research. Most disturbing of all, several individuals who had been contacted about the report began displaying behavioral changes that suggested they had been targeted for pharmaceutical intervention. The final network possessed the capability to neutralize potential opponents without resorting to traditional forms of violence or intimidation. By the summer of 1930, Elizabeth and Goldstein realized that their investigation had made them targets for the same experimental programs they were attempting to expose. Their communications were being monitored, their movements were being tracked, and people in their social and professional networks were being systematically compromised. Their response was to go underground, establishing a clandestine network of individuals who were committed to documenting and resisting the pharmaceutical totalitarianism that was spreading throughout Europe. But they also began preparing for the possibility that their resistance efforts might fail, and that future generations would need to understand what had been done to European civilization during this critical period. The documentation they created was hidden in locations throughout Europe, designed to survive even if the individuals who created it did not. The records included detailed testimonies from trafficking victims, technical specifications for experimental procedures, organizational charts showing the connections between criminal and political organizations, and analyses of how pharmaceutical techniques could be used to control entire populations. But perhaps most importantly, their documentation included warnings about how the techniques being developed in Europe could spread to other continents if they were not stopped. The final network was designed to be exportable, capable of being adapted to different cultures and political systems while maintaining its essential characteristics. Elizabeth's transformation from trafficking victim to criminal operative to resistance fighter represented something unprecedented in the history of the systems that had shaped her life. She had become living proof that even the most sophisticated techniques for controlling human behavior could not completely eliminate the capacity for moral choice and courageous action. But her individual resistance was taking place against a backdrop of social and political collapse that was creating ideal conditions for the expansion of pharmaceutical totalitarianism throughout Europe. The economic depression was generating massive numbers of desperate individuals who were vulnerable to any form of exploitation. The political polarization was destroying the moderate institutions that might have provided alternatives to extremist solutions. Most ominously, the collaboration between criminal organizations and political movements was producing hybrid systems that combined the worst aspects of both approaches to human control. The techniques that had been developed for exploiting individual trafficking victims were being scaled up and systematized for use against entire populations. As 1930 drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself preparing for what she knew would be the final phase of her conflict with the forces that had shaped her adult life. The heroin heiresses had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in demonstrating how pharmaceutical wealth could be used to corrupt and control human beings. But their success had also created the foundation for something far more terrible than anything they had ever imagined. The techniques they had pioneered were about to be deployed on a scale that would transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. And Elizabeth Hoffman, the 17-year-old farm girl who had come to Berlin seeking a better life, was about to become one of the last witnesses to the world that existed before pharmaceutical totalitarianism consumed everything in its path. The winter of 1931 would bring events that would determine whether Elizabeth's resistance efforts could prevent the final network from achieving its ultimate objectives, or whether the heroin heiress's legacy would be the destruction of human freedom itself. The story of pharmaceutical slavery in Weimar Germany was approaching its climax, and the outcome would reshape not just Europe, but the entire future of human civilization. The final confrontation began not with violence or dramatic revelation, but with a simple letter delivered to Elizabeth Hoffman on a snowy February morning in 1931. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of Anna Richter, the woman whose escape from the White Ladies 4 years earlier had seemed to mark the beginning of the end for Margaret von Siemens' empire. Anna had not disappeared into American anonymity as everyone had assumed. Instead, she had spent those 4 years building something that would prove far more dangerous to the final network than any government investigation or police raid. Working with contacts in New York's immigrant communities, she had created what she called the Underground Railroad for the living dead, a network designed specifically to extract women from pharmaceutical slavery operations before they could be processed into the final network's experimental programs. The letter Anna sent to Elizabeth contained detailed intelligence about final network operations that could only have come from sources deep within the organization itself. Anna had managed to place operatives inside facilities throughout Europe, women who had been trained to resist pharmaceutical conditioning while appearing to be successfully processed subjects. But Anna's letter also contained disturbing information about the true scope of what Elizabeth and Dr. Goldstein were fighting against. The final network was not limited to European operations. Similar experimental programs were being established in the United States, South America, and Asia, using techniques and personnel that had been exported from the German facilities. More ominously, Anna's intelligence revealed that the final network was preparing for what its architects called the Great Deployment, a coordinated activation of processed subjects throughout Europe that would coincide with major political events planned for the near future. The women who had been reduced to controllable resources through pharmaceutical experimentation were being positioned to influence elections, assassinate political opponents, and create social chaos that would justify even more extreme government measures. Elizabeth's response to Anna's letter was to organize what would become known as the Night of Broken Chains, a coordinated series of raids on final network facilities that was designed to both rescue experimental subjects and gather evidence that could expose the entire operation to international scrutiny. The Night of Broken Chains required Elizabeth to work with allies she had never imagined trusting. Former white ladies operatives who had become disillusioned with the organization's evolution into something beyond criminal enterprise. Nazi intelligence agents who had discovered that they themselves were targeted for pharmaceutical processing by their own superiors. Even government officials who had been protecting final network operations, but who had become concerned about losing control over their own personnel. The raids began simultaneously across 12 European cities on March 15, 1931. Each operation was led by women who had direct experience with pharmaceutical slavery, individuals who understood both the technical aspects of the experimental programs and the psychological conditioning methods used to maintain control over subjects. In Berlin, Elizabeth personally led the assault on the Kreuzberg facility, where she had discovered the true nature of the Phoenix Protocol. The building that had once housed Margaret's safe house had been expanded into a full medical laboratory where dozens of women were being processed through increasingly sophisticated experimental procedures. What Elizabeth found inside the facility exceeded even her worst expectations about what the final network had become. The experiments being conducted were no longer focused on creating controllable operatives for criminal or intelligence purposes. Instead, researchers were attempting to develop techniques that would allow them to rewrite human personality at the neurological level. The women being experimented on were not just having their behavior modified through drugs and conditioning. They were having their memories selectively erased and replaced, their emotional responses chemically altered, and their cognitive abilities enhanced or diminished according to the specific roles they were intended to fulfill. The technical documentation Elizabeth discovered revealed that final network researchers had succeeded in creating what they called modular personalities, psychological profiles that could be installed in experimental subjects like software programs. A single individual could be programmed with multiple personalities that could be activated through specific chemical or auditory triggers. But the most horrifying discovery was that these modular personalities were being designed for mass production. The researchers had developed standardized personality templates that could be installed in hundreds or thousands of subjects simultaneously, creating armies of individuals who would all respond identically to specific commands while appearing to maintain individual identities. Elizabeth's raid on the Berlin facility succeeded in rescuing 37 women who were in various stages of experimental processing, but it also revealed that the final network had progressed far beyond anything that could be stopped through conventional resistance methods. The system had become too large, too technically sophisticated, and too deeply integrated into European society to be dismantled through raids and exposures. The evidence Elizabeth gathered during the Night of Broken Chains confirmed her worst fears about the timeline for the Great Deployment. Final Network researchers had achieved breakthrough results in their personality modification experiments, and they were preparing to begin mass processing of subjects who would be deployed throughout European society over the following 12 months. The processed subjects would not be limited to women who had been trafficked through criminal networks. The Final Network had developed recruitment methods that could target any segment of the population that possessed skills or connections valuable for their objectives. Teachers, nurses, secretaries, shop clerks, factory workers, all of them could potentially be processed into controllable operatives without anyone in their social circles recognizing what had happened to them. Helena Kruger's response to the Night of Broken Chains demonstrated just how completely the original White Ladies organization had been transformed by its collaboration with Nazi research programs. Rather than attempting to protect her criminal enterprise from exposure, she ordered the immediate acceleration of the Great Deployment timeline. Helena had concluded that the Final Network's experimental phase was complete, and that further delays would only provide additional opportunities for resistance groups to disrupt their operations. Every woman who had been processed through their facilities would be activated simultaneously, regardless of whether they had completed their intended conditioning programs. The activation began on April 20th, 1931, with coordinated actions by processed subjects throughout Germany and Austria. Government officials found themselves being manipulated by secretaries and assistants who had been secretly processed through Final Network facilities. Business leaders discovered that their wives and daughters were providing detailed intelligence about their activities to unknown handlers. Military officers realized that nurses and support staff in their facilities were sabotaging equipment and stealing sensitive documents. But the activation also revealed a fundamental flaw in the Final Network's approach to controlling human behavior. Many of the processed subjects had retained enough independent thought to recognize what was happening to them when they received activation commands. Years of pharmaceutical conditioning had not completely eliminated their capacity for moral judgment, and some of them chose to resist their programming rather than carry out their assigned tasks. Elizabeth's Underground Railroad network had prepared for this possibility by establishing contact with processed subjects who showed signs of retained autonomy. When the activation began, these individuals served as double agents who appeared to comply with their programming while actually providing intelligence to resistance groups. The result was a shadow war that played out across European society, with processed subjects, resistance operatives, and government authorities all struggling to understand who could be trusted and what objectives were being pursued by the various factions involved in the conflict. Anna Richter's arrival in Berlin during the chaos of the activation marked the beginning of the final phase of the conflict between the Heroin heiresses and their opponents. Anna had spent 4 years building an organization that was specifically designed to counter pharmaceutical slavery operations, and she had returned to Europe with resources and expertise that could potentially turn the tide against the Final Network. Anna's Underground Railroad had developed techniques for reversing pharmaceutical conditioning that were based on methods used to treat severe psychological trauma. Working with American researchers who had been studying the effects of chemical dependency on brain function, she had created rehabilitation programs that could restore independent thought and moral judgment to women who had been processed through slavery networks. But Anna's rehabilitation techniques required time and resources that were not available during the crisis created by the Great Deployment. The processed subjects who were being activated throughout Europe needed immediate intervention if they were going to be prevented from carrying out their assigned tasks. Anna's solution was to distribute what she called liberation compounds, chemical formulations that could temporarily disrupt pharmaceutical conditioning, and allow processed subjects to regain enough autonomy to choose whether to resist their programming. The compounds were designed to be administered through water supplies, ventilation systems, or direct injection, depending on the specific circumstances of each situation. The distribution of liberation compounds throughout European cities created a biochemical battlefield where different chemical agents were being deployed by competing organizations attempting to control the same populations. Final network researchers responded by releasing their own compounds designed to reinforce conditioning in processed subjects and make them resistant to liberation attempts. Elizabeth found herself coordinating resistance efforts in a city where the very air and water had become weapons in a war over human consciousness. Processed subjects were receiving conflicting chemical signals that caused them to display erratic behavior as their conditioning systems fought against liberation compounds. Government authorities were unable to distinguish between genuine civil unrest and artificially induced chaos caused by competing biochemical interventions. The climax of this biochemical war came when Margaret von Siemens made her final appearance in the story that had consumed her life for over a decade. Margaret had been in hiding since the destruction of the Eternal Network, allowing Helena and her Nazi collaborators to manage the evolution of their criminal enterprise into something that transcended her original vision. But the chaos created by the Great Deployment had convinced Margaret that the final network had become too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The techniques she had pioneered for controlling individual trafficking victims were being used to wage war against entire populations, creating instability that threatened to destroy the social order that had made her criminal empire possible. Margaret's intervention took the form of releasing what she called the universal solvent, a chemical compound that would neutralize all forms of pharmaceutical conditioning, regardless of their source or sophistication. The compound had been developed as an emergency measure during the early days of the White Ladies organization, designed to protect key personnel from conditioning attempts by rival criminal groups. The release of the universal solvent throughout Berlin's water supply created immediate chaos as thousands of individuals who had been processed through various conditioning programs suddenly regained their independent thought and moral judgment. Processed subjects began abandoning their assigned tasks and seeking help from authorities they had previously been programmed to avoid. But the universal solvent also affected individuals who had been conditioned through legitimate medical and psychiatric treatments, creating a citywide mental health crisis as people who had been dependent on pharmaceutical interventions for genuine psychological problems suddenly found themselves without the chemical their stability. Elizabeth's support that had been Maintaining's final confrontation with the forces that had shaped her adult life took place in the ruins of the Kreuzberg facility, where she had first discovered the true nature of the Phoenix Protocol. The building had been abandoned during the chaos of the Great Deployment, but it still contained the technical equipment and documentation that represented the culmination of over a decade of experimentation on human subjects. Elizabeth's decision to destroy the facility was motivated not just by a desire to eliminate evidence of the final network's activities, but by a recognition that the knowledge contained in those documents represented a permanent threat to human freedom. The techniques that had been developed for pharmaceutical slavery could be rediscovered and reapplied by future organizations with similar objectives. The fire that consumed the Kreuzberg facility on May 1st, 1931, marked the symbolic end of the Heroin Heiresses empire and the beginning of a new phase in the struggle between those who sought to control human behavior and those who fought to preserve human autonomy. But it also represented something larger and more ominous about the direction European civilization was heading. The techniques that Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger had pioneered for exploiting individual trafficking victims had been transformed into tools for controlling entire populations. Even though their specific organization had been destroyed, the knowledge and methods they had developed were already being adapted by political movements that had far more ambitious goals than criminal profit. The shadow war between processed subjects and resistance operatives continued throughout the summer of 1931, but it was increasingly overshadowed by broader political developments that would ultimately make the specific techniques of pharmaceutical slavery irrelevant. The economic depression was creating social conditions that made entire populations vulnerable to any form of organization that promised stability and purpose. Elizabeth's final report to Dr. Goldstein's resistance network warned that the destruction of the final network had not eliminated the threat of pharmaceutical totalitarianism. Instead, it had demonstrated that such techniques were feasible and could be implemented on a massive scale by any organization with sufficient resources and scientific expertise. The Heroin Heiresses had succeeded in proving that human behavior could be controlled through chemical and psychological manipulation. Their failure had been in underestimating how attractive such techniques would be to political movements that understood their potential for social engineering on a continental scale. As 1931 drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself preparing for a different kind of resistance against forces that had learned everything the white ladies had taught about controlling human beings, but which had political objectives that made the Heroin Heiresses' criminal ambitions seem almost innocent by comparison. The story of pharmaceutical slavery in Weimar Germany had ended, but the techniques it had developed were about to be incorporated into political systems that would reshape not just Europe, but the entire future of human civilization. The Heroin Heiresses had opened a door that could never be completely closed again, and the consequences of their innovations were about to become apparent on a scale that would dwarf anything they had ever imagined. Anna Richter's final letter to Elizabeth, delivered on New Year's Eve 1931, contained a warning that would prove prophetic about the decade to come. The techniques they had fought so hard to expose and destroy were being studied and refined by political movements throughout Europe. The war they had been fighting against pharmaceutical slavery was about to become a much larger war against pharmaceutical fascism, and the stakes would be nothing less than the survival of human freedom itself. But that would be a different story, one that would unfold across battlefields and concentration camps rather than in the salons and safe houses where the Heroin Heiresses had perfected their methods of human control. The legacy of Margaret von Siemens and Helena Kruger would live on, but it would be implemented by forces that understood exactly how to use their innovations for purposes that transcended anything the original white ladies had ever contemplated. The transformation of pharmaceutical slavery into pharmaceutical fascism represented the final victory of the techniques the Heroin Heiresses had pioneered, even as it marked the complete destruction of the world in which those techniques had first been developed. The chaos and moral breakdown that had allowed the white ladies to thrive was about to be replaced by an order so total and systematic that individual criminal enterprises would become irrelevant. Elizabeth Hoffman's journey from trafficking victim to resistance fighter had taught her that even the most sophisticated systems of human control could not completely eliminate the capacity for moral choice. But it had also taught her that such systems could be scaled and systematized to the point where individual resistance became nearly impossible. The Heroin Heiresses of Weimar Berlin had written the instruction manual for pharmaceutical totalitarianism. The decade to come would demonstrate just how thoroughly their students had learned those lessons, and how completely those techniques could transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. The story of pharmaceutical slavery was ending, but the age of pharmaceutical fascism was about to begin. And there you have it. The story of how pharmaceutical wealth, moral collapse, and human desperation combined to create something that would haunt Europe for generations to come. Margarete von Siemens and Helena Kruger thought they were building criminal empires, but they were actually writing the playbook for controlling human souls. Their techniques didn't die with their organizations. They evolved into something far more terrifying that would consume an entire continent. The Heroin Heiresses had proven that people could be turned into products, and the world would never be the same.